September 2024. I stood in the hallway of my childhood home in suburban Ohio, my fingers trembling as I clutched a faded photograph of Robert. The walls around me, once alive with laughter and celebration, felt as cold as the morning air slipping through the windows. That's when Michael, now 50, and Linda, 48, stepped into the room together. Michael's voice caught and he said, "Mom, we've decided to sell this house." The photograph slipped from my hand and fluttered to the floor. In that moment, every memory I had of Robert, our first dance, the day we painted this living room together, the children's laughter, came crashing down like a storm. This house was his legacy, my sanctuary. With my heart pounding, I turned wordlessly and went to the guest room. I packed one suitcase, 2 dresses, my favorite shawl, and a handful of photographs, then slipped out the door before sunrise. When I set the key on the hall table and it clicked shut behind me, I heard nothing but my own breath. Michael and Linda stood frozen in the empty hallway, guilt and frustration etched on their faces. In that silence, I knew we had all crossed a line we could never uncross. I was born in 1946 in a small row house on the east side of Cleveland. My parents were hardworking folks. My father worked long shifts at a steel mill, and my mother scrubbed floors as a housekeeper. When I was 8, they both died in a sudden fire. My stern grandmother, who lived in a rented apartment just a few blocks away, took me in. I remember the day I left their warm home and walked into hers, clutching my favorite doll. The apartment was cramped, the paint chipped, and my grandmother never had much patience for my tears. She taught me that life didn't hand out favors. If I wanted something, I had to earn it. By the time I was 10, I had learned to make my own bed, wash my own clothes, and navigate the city buses to get to school. Losing my parents so young forced me to grow up fast, and I carried that self-reliance into adulthood. In 1965, when I was 19, I met Robert Walker at a local fair. He was working on a fellow mechanic's car stall. His hands were stained with grease, but his smile was gentle. I was selling homemade pies at my grandmother's side table. When I offered him a slice, he insisted on paying for it with a nickel. By the end of the night, I knew I'd found someone special. We married that December in a small church ceremony. Me in a simple white dress, Robert in his best suit. In 1968, we pooled what little we had and bought a modest 2-story house in the suburbs. I worked second-shift factory jobs making toys for Christmas, and Robert repaired cars during the day. We lived on peanut butter sandwiches and long hours, but we were determined to pay the mortgage. By 1985, we had that house paid off, and we moved in with our 2 children, Michael, born in 1969, and Linda, born in 1971. When Michael came home as a 2-year-old covered in crayon, I swapped evening lectures at the community college for nights, feeding him chicken soup and reading bedtime stories. When Linda joined the Little League team, I coached her games on Saturdays, cheering every time she swung the bat. To give them stability, I juggled factory shifts, part-time night classes, to improve my skills, and weekends volunteering at the local shelter. I wanted them to know that hard work and kindness could carry you through anything, just as it had carried me through my grandmother's tight grip on reality. In 1999, when I was 53, Robert died suddenly of a heart attack at 54. I still remember the way his breathing stopped one morning as he read the newspaper in our living room. He fell back, and I held him as he slipped away. In those days, grief felt like the coldest shadow. I sold my night classes to focus on keeping the home together. I converted our living room into a tiny home office, taking in boarders whenever I could. I worked mornings as a cashier at the grocery store, afternoons cleaning homes, and evenings as a part-time secretary for an insurance agency. I remember Michael and Linda watching me, stunted children who saw their mother tighten her jaw and keep going, despite the exhaustion that threatened to collapse her. I told myself Robert would have wanted us to stay in this house, so I did whatever it took. I cooked for boarders, balanced ledgers on my kitchen table, and tucked my children into bed with the same lullabies Robert used to sing. Michael graduated college and became a corporate recruiter. He moved to Chicago in 1995. Linda earned a marketing degree and took a job in a different state soon after. Their visits home became limited to holiday weekends. In the span of 2 decades, the house grew quiet. It no longer echoed with the sound of birthdays and holiday dinners. Instead, it held only the hollow footsteps of grown children swooping in to grab a casserole dish or leave a box of belongings. Home became a storage unit, a place where Michael and Linda kept their college textbooks and childhood toys, not the emotional anchor it had been when Robert was alive. I spent my evenings flipping through old photo albums, remembering the laughter of the past, while the rooms around me stayed still and empty, echoing the distance that had grown between us. Despite the long hours and late nights, I never let go of the lessons grief had taught me, that I was stronger than I ever knew. But as Michael's offer to sell this house echoed in my mind, I realized that the distance between us wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. And I was determined to find out if I could reclaim not only this house, but the love and respect that once bound our family together. Late August 2024. I knew something was off the moment Linda walked into the kitchen carrying a thick stack of papers. The late summer sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in the air, but the warmth didn't reach my heart. Michael had called a family meeting, and I sensed their hesitancy before they even spoke. Michael cleared his throat and sat down at the kitchen table. He placed a real estate flyer in front of me, an aerial photo of our house with a big "For Sale" banner across it. My eyes jumped to Linda, whose face was resolute yet sad. She said, "Mom, we've finalized an offer. We need to move forward by month's end." The words hit me like a stone. My vision blurred as my hands clenched the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles went white. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. This house was everything I had left of Robert. His laughter echoed in these walls, and every corner held a memory. I managed to whisper, "This was Robert's dream. It's all I have left." My voice cracked, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks. Michael's posture stiffened. "Mom, we need to downsize. We're not getting any younger, and this place is too big for you now." His words felt clinical, like a doctor telling someone they have to amputate a limb. Linda, standing by the sink, folded her arms. "Besides, selling now will secure both our futures. We can make sure you're comfortable with the proceeds." Remember the ache of that final sentence. Comfortable with the proceeds. It was as if they were offering me a consolation prize instead of the home where we'd built our lives together. I fought to steady my voice. "I understand you're thinking practically," I said, holding back a sob. "But this house isn't just bricks and mortar. It's every hope Robert and I had for our family. It's where Michael took his first steps, where Linda learned to ride her bike. It's where we celebrated every holiday, every birthday. It's not something you can just replace with money." Michael shook his head. "Mom, I love you, but this is the best decision. Trust us." Linda leaned forward. "We've talked to financial advisors. You'll have enough to live on comfortably, and maybe even travel if you want. You won't be alone. Marge and Pastor Lewis are ready to help." Their voices blended into a low hum, and I felt the walls closing in. I wanted to scream, to tell them it wasn't about the money. It was about my identity, my memories, everything Robert and I had built. But all I could do was stand slowly, my legs shaking, and walk away. Later that evening, I sat on my bed surrounded by photo albums, thick leather-bound volumes filled with pictures of our family through the years. Robert and me on our wedding day, Michael's first Christmas, Linda's high school graduation. I traced my finger over a photo of Robert's smiling face, the man who had taught me to dream bigger than my circumstances. The weight of decades of sacrifice pressed down on me. I had worked 3 jobs to keep this house, to send Michael and Linda to college. Now it felt as though the very foundation beneath me was being yanked away. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and unzipped it, pulling out Robert's favorite shawl, soft wool that still smelled faintly of his cologne. Folded it carefully and tucked it inside. Then I took out a pen and wrote a note on a small piece of stationery. I need to know who I am without this house. I left it on the kitchen table next to the real estate flyer. That night, I slipped out the front door before sunrise, the air cool on my face. I'm sure Michael and Linda woke to find the note in the empty house, pounding questions racing through their minds. I can almost hear Michael slamming a cabinet door in frustration, and Linda's muffled sobs as she struggled with her guilt. Even now, I'm not certain they fully understood how much this home meant to me. They convinced themselves I had savings, to live on, enough to be comfortable, but they didn't see that I needed more than just comfort. I needed the memories, the walls that held our laughter and tears, the place that rooted me to Robert's love. As I drove away in the dim morning light, I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I had to find myself outside these walls. I had to learn who Margaret Walker was without the home that had defined her for 56 years. I drove away from the house before dawn, taking only the narrow back roads that wound through dense pine forests. My destination was Marge's cottage, a place I hadn't visited since we were young mothers swapping recipes and trading gossip. As I turned onto the dirt lane, the familiar path felt strange, as though I were intruding on someone else's life. The cottage itself was small and rustic, its wooden siding weathered by years of sun and snow. I hesitated on the porch, my suitcase in hand, and wondered how I had ever found comfort here. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the scent of pine and the faint echo of memories. Marge's hearty laughter, our children playing in the yard. But tonight the silence was thick, punctuated only by the sound of my own footsteps. The living area was sparsely furnished. A worn sofa, a rickety coffee table, and a small wood-burning stove that Marge insisted I keep stoked. I glanced around the cramped space and realized that the wood's hush felt as lonely as the empty rooms I had just left behind. After unpacking my few belongings, I sat on the edge of the sofa and opened a small leather pouch where Robert had tucked our savings. It was a modest sum, money he had invested in bonds for our future. Tears welled in my eyes as I counted the bonds, reminding myself that I wasn't destitute. I could use those funds to rent a studio apartment in the nearby town. But counting, money did little to fill the ache in my chest. Robert's steady presence had always been my anchor. Without him, and without the house, it felt as though the ground beneath me might give way at any moment. The next morning, I found a tiny studio apartment not far from Marge's cottage. It had a single window, a stained carpet, and a kitchenette, so small that I could touch both walls by extending my arms. Yet it was mine for now, and it cost less than half of what we once paid in mortgage. As I carried my meager belongings inside, a quilt Robert had embroidered for me, a few books, and my journal, I admitted that none of this felt like home. For 56 years, every floorboard, every corner of our house had embraced me. Now, I sat on the thin mattress, listening to the hum of the radiator and the distant sound of traffic, wondering where home might be. Nights were the hardest. I lay awake, tormented by flashbacks. Robert's booming laughter as he teased Michael for dancing like a goat. The first time Michael took his wobbly steps across the living room. Linda's third-grade recital when she sang Amazing Grace so quietly, I had to lean in to hear her. At each memory, I felt my heart clench and tears stream down my cheeks. I whispered into the darkness, "Jesus, I miss him," and clutched my pillow as though it might give me comfort. But the pillow was cold, and the silence swallowed my words. One afternoon, Marge appeared on my doorstep with a pot of homemade beef stew, its steam carrying the scent of carrots and onions. Alongside it were crossword puzzles she had saved from old newspapers. Thought you might need something to warm your belly and your mind, she said, squeezing my hand. I invited her in, and she sat at the tiny kitchen table, telling me stories about neighbors and cats and the way the sun shone through the pines. It felt like a lifeline, albeit a fragile one. Every evening, I settled into the small desk I'd shoved into a corner of the studio and wrote in my journal. I poured out my grief, my fear, and my anger onto the blank pages. Sometimes my handwriting shook so badly that I could barely read what I'd written the day before. But writing helped anchor me, kept me from drifting into despair. When the weather cooperated, I walked to a nearby creek, the water sparkling in the late afternoon sun. The sound of the creek's gentle babble reminded me of the solace I once found in nature, when Robert and I had picnicked here as newlyweds, before we had children. Now I walked alone, the water's rhythm echoing the pulse of my grief. I invited Robert's memory to walk beside me as I breathed deeply, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. Back at the cottage or in my apartment, I could not escape the rumors swirling behind my back. Word reached Michael and Linda that I'd moved into a shabby apartment. I imagined Michael frowning at his phone screen, worried I was living in squalor. Linda likely fought tears at her desk when she read the same text from a cousin. Aunt Margaret's lost her mind, living in that dump. Even distant relatives whispered that I was a foolish old woman clinging to the past. Michael and Linda exchanged uneasy glances, each questioning whether they had overreacted. They told themselves that my savings would keep me comfortable, that I could rebuild a life somewhere else. Yet I sensed their worry beneath the surface, the guilt of having turned their backs on me, of treating the only home I'd ever known as an expendable asset. Despite the loneliness and the whispers, I held onto the belief that I would find strength again. Each spoonful of Marge's stew, each word in my journal, and each step along the creek reminded me that while I had lost my house, I hadn't lost myself. And in that fragile conviction, I began to understand that perhaps home wasn't just a building. It was the person I became when I dared to believe I could survive beyond those walls. Marge arrived one crisp morning with a basket of homemade biscuits and a wide-eyed look that told me she had news. We sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea as the sun filtered through lace curtains. "Margaret," she said, voice soft but urgent, "do you remember seeing something in the deed about a life estate?" I frowned, trying to recall. Years ago, when Robert and I first signed the paperwork, I had skimmed over legal jargon without thinking twice. Marge pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, a photocopy of the deed's fine print. "Robert placed a life estate in your name," she explained gently. "That means you have the right to live here for the rest of your life, regardless of any sale." My heart stumbled at the words I had never bothered to understand, trusting Michael and Linda would always honor their father's wishes. That same afternoon, I found myself standing before the county clerk's window at the courthouse, my hands trembling as I handed over my ID. The clerk retrieved the official property records, and I returned to a small reading room down the hall. My fingers shook as I scanned the document until I saw it. Reversionary interest. Sale proceeds restricted until beneficiary well-being secured. In plain words, it meant that my children couldn't access any money from selling the house without proving I was provided for. If they tried to sell without my signature, the entire transaction could be declared void. A surge of relief and indignation swept through me. I realized I held a power I had never known existed, a safeguard Robert had built into our lives to protect me. That very evening, Marge introduced me to Sandra Kim, a pro bono attorney in her 50s, who volunteered hours at the local senior center. Sandra's office smelled of old books and fresh coffee, and she greeted me with a firm handshake. After I explained everything, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mrs. Walker, your life estate is ironclad. Michael and Linda cannot sell this house without your consent. If they attempt it, we can file to block the sale immediately." She outlined the steps, a formal notice to Michael and Linda, an injunction if they moved forward, and how the reversionary Interest forced their hand. For the first time in weeks, I felt tears of hope slip down my cheeks. Sandra's words lifted a weight from my shoulders. Robert's foresight had given me a shield I never knew I needed. That night, back in my modest studio apartment, I sat at the narrow desk by the window, lit only by a small lamp. I held the deed in my hands, pages filled with legalese that now meant everything. I practiced what I would say to Michael and Linda. I'm here to help with the repairs, but understand that this house is mine until I'm gone. You cannot sell it without my permission. I repeated those lines until the tremble in my voice steadied. Standing before the mirror, I saw my reflection. Cheeks still reddened from tears, yet my posture was straighter, my eyes firmer. I whispered, to myself, they'll see I'm not powerless. It felt as if a part of me had been resurrected by the knowledge that I held the final key to our family home. Over the next few days, I made plans carefully. I called Marge to let her know I would be staying at her cottage a bit longer. I told Doug, the handyman who used to help Robert with the roof, that I'd like to borrow his ladder for a few hours. By framing my return as assistance with final repairs, I hoped to catch Michael and Linda off guard. Unlikely they'd suspect I knew my rights. Each step I took felt precarious, nervous, yet calculated. I had lived most of my life trusting others, but now I was placing trust in myself and in the protections Robert had placed long ago. On the morning I returned to the house, the sun was just beginning to climb the sky. I drove slowly up the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, and parked by the garage. My heart hammered as I gathered a toolbox, the deed copies, and my letter from Sandra. As I stepped onto the front porch, I inhaled a deep breath of the morning air, crisp and tinged with pine from the neighbor's yard. The door opened before I knocked, and Michael looked at me with a mixture of surprise and guilt. Linda hovered behind him, eyes red as though she had been crying. For a moment, I merely stood there, suitcase in hand, and looked at the place that had been my whole life. Then, with the deed nestled in my purse, and the resolve firm in my chest, I walked inside, ready to reclaim what was mine, and to let them see that I would not be erased. Reconnecting with my neighbors felt like returning to a lifeline I didn't know I still had. On a crisp autumn morning, I gathered my courage and walked down Maple Street to visit Mrs. Thompson's house. She was 80 and bent slightly from years of gardening, but her eyes still gleamed with kindness. When I knocked, she opened the door and enveloped me in a warm hug. "Maggie, dear," she said, using the name she'd called me since childhood. Come in, come in." Her living room was filled with floral upholstery and lace doilies, just as I remembered. We settled into her well-worn armchairs, and she poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot. "Margaret," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice soft but firm. "Do you recall when Robert built that addition for my mother in 1989? I nodded, tears welling at the memory of my husband climbing scaffolding, hammering with determination so his own ailing mother-in-law would be safe and warm. Mrs. Thompson placed a folder in my lap. "I've written a sworn statement about how Robert and you sacrificed for everyone around you. I'm sending this to your attorney. Sandra can use it as evidence of your lifelong care for this house and community." I clutched her hands, overwhelmed by gratitude. "Thank you, Alice. Your words mean more than you know." That afternoon, I stopped by my church, First Baptist on Oak Avenue. Pastor David Lewis greeted me at the door, his tie loosened for comfort and his eyes sincere. "Margaret, the congregation has been praying nonstop for you." He guided me to a small office where several church ladies had already gathered, each clutching envelopes. "Pastor David asked us to write character affidavits," said Mrs. Carmichael, a retired schoolteacher. "We remember your kindness, how you taught Sunday school for decades and hosted potlucks when anyone needed a meal." Another member, Janet Mills, handed me a bouquet of fresh dahlias. "We're organizing care meals Every Wednesday you'll have a casserole or soup waiting on your doorstep. Tears threatened again, but I forced a smile. I don't know how to thank you all. Pastor Lewis placed a hand on my shoulder. You've given so much to this community, Margaret. Let us stand with you now. That evening, as I sorted through the envelopes in my apartment, I noticed my phone lighting up with notifications. Curious, I clicked on the link to a neighborhood blog by Sarah Nguyen, a local blogger known for her fair-minded perspective. The headline read, "Family blames matriarch. Is it right to erase her home?" Sarah had written about the rumors swirling around my departure and the children's plan to sell the house. She highlighted my decades of sacrifice and asked readers to consider whether it was just to uproot a widow from her lifelong home. Comments poured in. "Margaret deserves respect," wrote one neighbor. "I can't believe those children would do this to their mother," wrote another. Dozens signed their names or shared similar stories of elder parents being mistreated. I sat in astonishment, scrolling through each supportive message. For the first time since that morning in September, I felt buoyed by a community that saw me and valued my life. When Linda called the next day, her voice broke as soon as I answered. "Mom, I'm coming over," she said. Within an hour, she appeared at my door, her eyes red and rimmed. I welcomed her inside and led her to the modest couch, offering her a cup of tea before she even sat down. "Mom," she began, voice quivering. "I saw the blog, the comments. People are angry at us." I nodded, sipping my tea. "Linda, I have to ask, did you see the life estate clause in the deed?" Her shoulders slumped. "No, I didn't. She swallowed hard, tears spilling over. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I feel horrible." I held her hand. "I never wanted to shame you or Michael. I just need you to understand why this house means so much." Her head dropped, and she sobbed softly. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant to hurt you." With that, she left, overwhelmed but shaken, leaving me to feel a mixture of sorrow and relief that she was beginning to see the truth. That afternoon, I received an email alert that Michael had tried to set up a meeting with our family friend, Tom Evans, who worked as a real estate broker. Understandably, Michael wanted to figure out how to push the sale forward despite the life estate. When I learned of his plan, I felt a twinge of frustration. He still hadn't grasped that the law was on my side. Before I could worry too much, I remembered Sandra's reassurance. We had the evidence we needed. As the sun sank low outside my window, I sat at my small desk and reflected on the path ahead. I wasn't just fighting to keep a house. I was fighting to reclaim the respect and dignity that had defined my life. With my neighbors' sworn statements, the church's support, and public sentiment behind me, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road wouldn't be easy, but I finally understood that I didn't have to walk it alone. I arrived at the house just before noon, pretending I was there to help stage it for potential buyers. I parked in the driveway and took a deep breath, adjusting the lightweight tote bag across my shoulder. Inside was my toolbox, a few cleaning rags, and a copy of the deed in a manila envelope. Margaret Walker, fixer-upper volunteer. That was my alias for the day. When I stepped through the front door, the scent of stale air and musty rugs hit me first, but the sight of the familiar living room struck deeper. Michael greeted me with a polite nod, sliding a set of paint cans and brushes into my hands. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, not quite looking me in the eye. "We want the walls repainted for the listing photos." Linda hovered nearby, holding a feather duster. "You can dust off all the relics on those shelves," she instructed quietly. Her tone was courteous but distant, as though she were talking to a hired hand rather than her mother. I watched her wipe a knick-knack, my wedding vase, without pausing to remember where it came from. Behind closed doors, As I scrubbed at the same corner of the mantel where Robert used to display his hunting trophies, I felt my heart pound. Each stroke of the duster threatened to stir memories I wasn't sure I could face, but I steadied myself. I was here for a purpose. I wouldn't flinch. Late that afternoon, I waited until Michael and Linda were both sitting on the sofa, flipping through real estate brochures, and called them into the living room. The afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, illuminating dust motes in the air. I placed the deed on the coffee table and closed my hands over it. Their heads snapped up, confusion mingling with suspicion in their eyes. "This house is mine, until I die," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Selling it without my consent is unlawful." I slid the deed toward them, then pointed to the life estate clause on the first page. "Robert put this in place for me. You either honor it, or this sale is invalid." For a moment, silence seemed to stretch forever. Then Linda's face flushed as she gasped, eyes narrowing. "You're just making excuses to avoid getting real. Help!" She leaned forward, confronting me as though I were the intruder. "You could downsize like the rest of us. Instead, you're clutching onto an old piece of paper." I met her gaze and said, "It's not about clawing at the past, Linda. It's about respecting the wishes Robert laid out. This clause is as binding as any law. Read it yourself. Your signatures on the will mean nothing here." Michael shot up from the sofa, his face red with anger. Without warning, he snatched the deed from the table and tore it in half. Paper fluttered to the floor as he slammed his hand on the wooden surface. "Fine. Call your attorney. We'll go to court." His voice trembled, but his glare was sharp as a knife. Tears sprang to Linda's eyes. "You're destroying our plans," she choked out, her tears flowing freely now. I could see the fear behind her anger, the fear of losing the sale proceeds they'd already allocated to their new lives. Michael spun on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Linda and me alone amid the faded upholstery and strewn papers. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I felt my own vision blur as I turned away to steady myself against the back of the sofa. Alone in the living room, the house seemed to hold its breath. Memories flooded back, Robert's raspy voice telling me to keep fighting at his deathbed, his hand wrapped around mine as he whispered, "Promise me you'll protect our home." I sank onto the sofa, clutching the torn deed fragments that still clung together, and let the tears come. A wave of doubt washed over me. Had I done the right thing by coming back? Was it selfish to fight them so fiercely? I pressed my head against the sofa's arm and closed my eyes, wanting only to vanish from this place that once felt so safe. But then I remembered the letters I'd received, handwritten notes from Pastor Lewis, affirmations from Mrs. Thompson, the church lady's assurances of support. Those words reminded me that I wasn't facing this alone. I took a shallow breath and exhaled slowly, letting a small measure of resolve return. I gathered the deed fragments, smoothing them out on the coffee table even though they were useless torn pieces. In that moment, I realized that the paper itself wasn't what Robert had given me. His promise had been forged in love and intention, a promise that a tear in paper could never destroy. Margaret Walker rose from the sofa, brushing tears from her cheeks. I picked up the envelope containing the original untorn deed and placed it carefully in my purse. Standing in the stillness of the room, I felt a flicker of that old strength Robert once admired in me. They could try to scare me into giving up, but I had already found my backbone. I stepped into the hallway, leaving Linda's sobs behind. As I closed the door to the living room, I whispered to myself, "I will not be erased." With Sandra Kim's guidance, I arrived at the courthouse early on a crisp November morning. I carried the unopened envelope containing the affidavits from Mrs. Thompson, Pastor Lewis, and the church ladies, as well as a printed copy of Sarah Nguyyen's blog post. Sandra met me by the metal detector, her expression calm as always. I felt my heart flutter. but I reminded myself that this was our moment to set the record straight. When we entered the courtroom, it felt like stepping into a different world. Polished wood benches, sunlight filtering through tall windows, and an air thick with anticipation. Sandra and I sat at one table, Michael and Linda at another. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras aimed like silent witnesses. Judge Harriet Chang, known for her no-nonsense approach, took her seat promptly at 9:01 a.m., gavel in hand. Sandra rose to speak first. She laid out our case succinctly. Your Honor, this is a matter of honoring Mr. Walker's explicit intent. The life estate in Mrs. Walker's name is binding. We present the original deed, complete with Robert Walker's signature, and accompanying affidavits from neighbors attesting to Mrs. Walker's decades of sacrifices. We also submit public commentary from a respected local blogger, which illustrates the community's support and highlights the moral context of this dispute. She passed a neatly organized binder across to the bailiff, who handed it to the clerk. The judge examined the documents. Her expression remained impassive until she reached the life estate clause. Then she raised her gaze and met my eyes, offering a small nod as if to encourage me. I suppressed a tremble and sat back, tears already prickling my eyelids. Next, Judge Chang called Michael to the stand. He approached reluctantly, each step heavy with the gravity of his actions. Sandra had prepared a series of questions intended to reveal the truth. Mr. Walker, Sandra began, voice steady. Did you disclose the life estate clause to Mrs. Walker before you attempted to sell this property? Michael's face twisted, and he swallowed hard. No, he admitted, gaze dropping to the floor. The silence that followed hung over the room like a thick fog. Sandra pressed on gently but firmly. Why not, Mr. Walker? Michael closed his eyes for a moment, as though summoning courage. Because Mom would never agree to the sale. His voice cracked on the last word. He opened his eyes then, and I thought I saw regret flicker in his gaze, but it was gone almost as quickly. I thought she would put up a fight that would delay everything indefinitely. Witnesses in the gallery exchanged glances, some nodding, others shaking their heads. The judge jotted notes, and I felt a surge of vindication wash over me. The truth I'd known quietly for weeks was now out in the open. When Michael sat down, I saw Linda's knees trembling as she clutched her purse. Evidently, she had intended to speak, but found herself paralyzed by guilt. Her cheeks were pale as she remembered how, years before, I'd mortgaged the house to pay for her tuition. She swallowed hard and stared at the polished wood floor, tears pooling in her eyes. I wanted to reach out to her, but I remained seated, letting the moment unfold. Sandra then rested her case, and Judge Chang called for closing statements. The judge's gavel tapped lightly as she prepared to announce her ruling. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Finally, her voice rang clear and authoritative. Mrs. Walker's life estate is valid and enforceable. Any attempt to sell or transfer ownership of the property without her consent is void. Therefore, Mrs. Walker retains sole right of possession. I hereby grant her motion for an injunction. Mr. Walker, you are ordered to vacate the premises within 14 days. If you refuse to comply with this ruling, at that pronouncement, Michael and Linda's heads sagged. Michael leaned forward, hiding his face in his hands, and Linda wiped her tears with a trembling hand. The weight of public humiliation was evident in their slumped shoulders. Outside, the courthouse, the autumn air felt even colder as journalists swarmed us. Camera lenses clicked relentlessly as I stepped onto the front steps. Neighbors, some clutching "Justice for Margaret" signs, stood on the sidewalks, applauding quietly. Sarah Nguyen was there with her phone, live-streaming the moment. "Mother's legacy preserved," read the banner behind her camera. "Margaret Walker has won her home back." I felt a rush of gratitude as supporters handed me small bouquets of wildflowers and hugs from congregation members. I spotted Pastor Lewis holding a placard that read, "Respect your elders," and Mrs. Thompson beamed as she offered me a homemade pumpkin pie. Michael and Linda remained nearby, framed by the glare of video lights, looking crushed. I saw the weight of their shame and regret mirrored in their downward gazes. Reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Walker, how does it feel to have justice served?" I managed to answer, my voice steady. "I'm grateful to everyone who stood by me. This house was never just a building. It was my family's legacy." As the cameras captured my words, I realized something profound. I had not only reclaimed a house, but I had also reclaimed my dignity. The public judgment had lifted. The burden of silence I'd carried since Robert's death. The community's support reminded me that I had never been alone, even when it felt like it. That day, as I left the courthouse, I felt the house's stone walls and tall windows behind me, safe in the knowledge that no paper could strip me of the love and memories I held inside. The turning point had come, and in its wake, justice and truth had finally prevailed. That evening, I set a simple table in the dining room of my reclaimed home, white candles flickering, a pot roast in the oven, and fresh-baked bread cooling on a wooden board. I'd invited Pastor Lewis, Sandra Kim, and Mrs. Thompson for a modest meal, wanting to share this victory with those who had stood by me. The windows were open, allowing the late summer breeze to drift in and carry the faint sound of crickets from the yard. As I arranged the final place settings, I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest. For the first time in months, I could enjoy a meal in this house without dread. A sharp knock on the front door startled me. I recognized Michael's heavy footsteps immediately, followed by Linda's hesitant tapping. Despite the warm glow inside, I sensed tension bubbling over. I took a deep breath. And Norton, the elderly golden retriever who'd wandered onto my porch earlier that day, padded over and sniffed my ankles. I knelt to stroke his head, trying to steady my nerves, then stood and walked to open the door. Michael and Linda stood side by side in the foyer, faces drawn. Michael's suit was rumpled, and Linda wiped tears from her cheeks as she looked up at me. "Mom," Michael began, voice tight, "we've come to settle our affairs. We know the ruling, but we still feel..." Linda cut in, her voice cracking. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to hurt like this." She sank to her knees on the wooden floor, her hands twisted in her skirt. Tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her arms. I stood behind the door, my face calm but resolute. "I'm sorry you're in this pain, Linda," I said, voice gentle but firm. "But this house is no longer a place for apologies or confessions. I'm hosting dinner with friends tonight. I'm afraid I must ask you to leave." The words were hard to say, but I steeled myself, thinking of the prayerful letters Pastor Lewis had brought, the affidavits from Mrs. Thompson, and all the neighbors rallying behind me. Linda's body trembled as she struggled to speak, each word a sob. I never asked what this house meant to you. I took it for granted, Mom. I'm so..." Her broken apology hung in the air, but I could not let her trample through my home. Michael reached out abruptly and grabbed my hand, his grip urgent. "I just wanted security for my family," he said, voice thick with remorse. "We thought selling the house would be the safest choice." I released a steadying breath, lifting his hand in mine. "Your security was built on my sacrifice, Michael. You never asked if I still needed this home." My voice echoed in the hallway. "This house isn't just a piece of property. It's my history, my husband's legacy, our children's foundation. And it's mine to occupy until my last breath." Michael's face crumpled as he let go of my hand. Linda, still crouched on the floor, buried her face in her hands, silent tears racking her shoulders. Neither of them knew what to do next. Stepped back into the living room, and the three of us paused in the doorway. Through the open windows, I could hear a soft murmur. Pastor Lewis's congregation gathering on the lawn, holding candles. I knew they intended to sing my favorite hymn, Amazing Grace. The knowledge bolstered me. I was not standing alone. As if on cue, the first notes of the hymn floated through the window. Church members, faces illuminated by candlelight, began to sing in harmony. The sweet, familiar melody drifted across the yard, rising in strength as more voices joined in. I felt a lump form in my throat. The children heard it too. Michael's shoulders sagged, and Linda's tears slowed as she listened, realization dawning. Linda rose to her feet, knees shaky. She approached me, her voice small. "Mom, please forgive me. I didn't understand." Her eyes were wide with shame. "I was afraid of losing what I thought was ours. I never saw how deeply you loved this place." Michael stood behind Linda, head bowed. He ran a hand through his hair. "Margaret, I'm sorry too. I didn't appreciate all you gave us. I thought I was protecting us, but I was wrong." I felt my own tears well as I watched their fragile admissions. The song continued, each verse a balm to my wounded heart. Neighbors and church members on the lawn held their candles high, their voices unwavering. The night air wove around us, carrying the hymn's final notes into the darkening sky. Linda fell to her knees before me, tears still glistening. "Mom, I beg your forgiveness," she said, voice raw. Michael knelt beside her, hand resting lightly on her back. "We were blinded by our own plans. We see now that this house is your life, not a commodity." I looked down at them, my heart aching with both sorrow and love. When Linda reached for my hand, I lifted it gently and offered her an embrace. As I hugged her, I whispered, "I forgive you. But understand this. I won't return to a place where my worth is measured in dollars." Michael, still kneeling, lifted his head. "We'll help you honor this house, Mom. Whatever you need will be here. No more doubts." Stepping back, I wiped my own tears and turned to the open window where the congregation's candlelight flickered. In the center of the lawn, Pastor Lewis closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks as he finished the hymn. Mrs. Thompson stood nearby, holding a framed photo of Robert, and the church ladies formed a tight cluster, their faces shining with pride. In that moment, the emotional reversal was complete. Michael and Linda's faces reflected understanding, humility, and remorse. I felt no triumph over their pain, only relief that they finally recognized the home's meaning, a tapestry of love, memories, and sacrifice woven through 56 years. I inhaled deeply and turned back to my children. "Come," I said softly. "Join us for dinner." Together, we walked into the dining room where Pastor Lewis, Sandra, and Mrs. Thompson awaited. As I took my seat at the head of the table, Michael and Linda found places at my side, and the rest of our small gathering offered nods of welcome. That night, as the candles flickered and the laughter began to fill the room once more, I realized the house was never just a structure. It was my story, and now, my children understood that it was far more precious than any sum they might have gained from its sale. In the weeks that followed, I discovered a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The house, once silent and empty, began to fill with laughter and activity. I partnered with Pastor Lewis to launch a literacy program in the living room. A small group of children from the neighborhood gathered on mismatched sofas each afternoon as I read to them from well-worn storybooks. Their eyes widened at each turn of the page, and I could almost feel Robert's presence, smiling at the joy we created together. On Wednesday evenings, I opened the back parlor for a grief support group we named the Walker House Foundation, in Robert's honor. People from all walks of life, Widows, young parents who had lost a child, people struggling with loneliness, came to share their stories. We sat in a circle of folding chairs, holding mugs of coffee or tea, our voices soft at first but growing stronger as we spoke. When I stood and spoke about my own loss, I felt the pain settle into something less sharp. Each tear I shed seemed to water the seeds of healing in others' hearts. Outside, the neglected garden found new life. Neighborhood children, some, who once visited only to drop off boxes for me, now came equipped with gloves and trowels. Together we cleared weeds and planted rows of marigolds and daisies. Watching their small hands pat down soil around each fragile bloom reminded me how life could flourish again, even in places left for dead. When the first flowers opened bright in the summer sun, I felt a quiet pride in knowing this garden would stand as a living testament to resilience. Michael and Linda, too, began to find a path forward. They volunteered each Saturday morning, reading to the children in the literacy program and helping me organize the support group meetings. One afternoon, I found Michael struggling with his note cards, attempting to address the circle about his own mistakes. When he spoke, his voice quivered. I thought selling this house was the only way. I was blind to what it meant to my mother, what it meant to all of us. Linda stood beside him, nodding, tears filling her eyes. Their honesty humbled me, and I realized that trust could be rebuilt, though it might take time. As December approached, we prepared for a modest Christmas gathering. I decorated the mantel with evergreen boughs and placed a wreath on the front door. Michael and Linda brought homemade cookies and insisted on setting the table, placing simple candles and placing a single poinsettia in the center. When the day arrived, I sat at the head of the table, gratitude washing over me as I looked around. Michael on one side, Linda on the other, Sandra Kim and Pastor Lewis smiling across from me, and Mrs. Thompson seated at my left. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon, and soft music played in the background. When dinner concluded, Michael and Linda exchanged a knowing glance, then handed me a large photo album bound in red velvet. Inside were pictures chronicling my life. A childhood birthday party at my grandmother's apartment, Robert and me on our wedding day, my children's first steps, the day we moved into this house, and finally, images from the recent weeks, children reading, neighbors gathering in support, and me standing before the garden's first blooms. As I turned each page, tears welled once more, but this time they were bittersweet, mixed with pride and relief. Late that night, I sat by the windowsill in my bedroom, the house quiet, except for the ticking clock on the mantel. I opened my journal and wrote, "They tried to sell my past, but I found my future in love and purpose. This house isn't mine. It belongs to every heart it shelters." I closed the journal and felt a gentle peace settle over me. This house, built with love and sacrifice, had become something greater than a shelter. It had become a beacon of hope and healing, exactly what Robert would have wanted. 6 months later, in March 2025, I find myself standing in the kitchen of my beloved home, the morning sun pouring through the window above the sink. My hands are dusted with flour as I roll out dough for Robert's favorite apple pie. On the counter, a small bronze plaque catches the light. Walker House Foundation. I pause for a moment, tasting cinnamon on my breath, and remember how this house was once at the center of so much turmoil. Now, it glows with renewal. Through the window, I watch Mrs. Jensen, a young widow from our support group, cross the front walk. She approaches with her daughter in tow, offering me a tight hug. "Margaret, you gave me hope when I thought I'd lost everything," she whispers. Tears fill my eyes as I scoop her into another embrace. Behind her, I hear the delighted laughter of children playing in the adjoining library space. Linda is there now, volunteering every Wednesday, reading stories aloud and guiding them through art projects. Their voices drift in like a song, reminding me why this happened in the first place. Later that afternoon, Michael steps up to the podium at the local Rotary Club meeting. I sit in the audience with Pastor Lewis and Mrs. Thompson, pride swelling in my chest. Michael's voice is steady as he speaks about the importance of respecting elders' rights. He shares his own mistakes candidly, admitting that he once saw our home purely as an asset. "I was blind to my mother's sacrifices," he says. "Her life was built on love, not dollars. We must protect our elders' security and dignity." Afterward, both Michael and Linda announce they will contribute a portion of their incomes to a new senior home safety grant established by the Rotary Club. Watching them, I realize they have truly changed. As dusk falls, I slip out onto the front porch with a slice of warm apple pie tucked into my hand. I settle into the wooden rocking chair, feeling the gentle creak beneath me. The garden, once a tangle of weeds, now blooms with marigolds, daisies, and lavender, their colors muted by the fading golden light. I take a slow bite of pie, savoring the sweet warmth, and let the evening breeze brush against my cheeks. In that quiet moment, I close my eyes and whisper into the cooling air, "Robert, we did it." Across the street, a few of our neighbors stand by candles, offering their silent support. I think of every volunteer who helped build the foundation, every child I saw learn to read, every tear shed and prayer said. As I rock gently, the camera of my mind pulls back to reveal my silhouette framed by blossoms, a testament to resilience, renewal, and a matriarch who refused to be forgotten. If this story touched your heart, please like and leave a comment sharing your own experiences of standing up for what matters most. Don't forget to subscribe for more true life tales of strength and hope, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Your support means the world to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.